Oh, says the bold King Billy in an old song, the Reverend George Walker reflected the same spirit of defiance when he led the defence of Derry, shown in the second tapestry. That spirit of defiance, of no surrender, carries echoes and reverberations that are only all too painfully familiar to us, right down to our own day. The cannon at the Boyne, like the cannon on the walls of Derry, and those here in the forecourt of what was once an Irish House of Parliament, all spoke with that same singular sense of purpose which spelled out imperial supremacy and colonial control. Apart from Grattan and those with him who opposed the Act of Union, not with the tongues of men and angels did the others speak, but with a power that speaks through the barrel of a gun. And the pomp and circumstance of subsequent royal visits to this second city in their united kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, surrounded as it was by all the power and the glory of a world empire at the very height of its prestige, brought out an enthusiastic populace, many of them, no doubt, proud to be numbered amongst their loyal subjects, many more brainwashed into believing that the panoply, the colour and the costume were indeed bread and circuses for them, and some, with their hats off, shouting from the rooftops in salute to a power which had done them the great good service of taking away from them whatever small measure of independence they had. A poet of an earlier century would write of a similar national betrayal some 200 years before.
Shame upon your Irish hands. None of you stands untainted. Foreign lords divide your lands, while you, unmoved, assented.
Fubum fue vallo gael, ni waren eine agaf, gael ag cyfryn vor grieche, is slua shiha vor Saul.
It must surely be a matter of some satisfaction that the old Parliament where Henry Grattan spoke for Irish independence should now be an internationally known Irish banking house and a centre for successful 20th century native Irish commerce. That independence, when finally achieved, stemmed in no small way from this house in the Dublin suburb of Rathfarnham. For this was Pearse's school, St Enda's, Scoil Éirne. Going through the house and about the grounds here, one may sense something of the courage and the commitment of a man who felt that, as his school had the highest aim in education of any school in Ireland, it must have the worthiest home. The house is now a museum. It was bequeathed to the nation as a memorial for my two sons, Patrick and William, by his mother, Meath woman Margaret Brady, about whom he wrote some of his most moving verse.
I do not grudge them. Lord, I do not grudge my two strong sons that I have seen go out to break their strength and die. They and a few in bloody protest for a glorious thing. They shall be spoken of among their people. The generations shall remember them and call them blessed. But I will speak their names to my own heart in the long nights, the little names that were familiar once round my dead hearth. Lord, thou art hard on mothers. We suffer in their coming and their going. And though I grudge them not, I weary of the long sorrow. And yet I have my joy. My sons were faithful, and they fought.
The opulent look of a room like this might give the impression that St Enda's and its bookish founder had no worries, but the fact is that from the time he set up here in 1910, they were often in financial trouble. Within a few short years, more and more of the energy of the schoolmaster and the scholar in him was diverted into coping with these money matters. The main museum room in St Enda's, as it now is, recalls those early days when the house served the dual purpose of being both school premises and family home. James Pearse was a young English stone carver who came to Ireland in the 1850s when church building was in full swing. The four children of his second wife, the first had died, would seem to have had a fairly easy time of it. There are pictures of them in which both dress and appearance suggest a lifestyle which, to say the least of it, was far from poor. Some of them even give the impression of a fairly upper-crust family with all the pastimes and ambitions of the then upwardly mobile middle class. The St. Enda's project swallowed up all that family money and a great deal more, dedicated as it was to the full rounded education of the child, with committed teachers like Con Colbert, poet and dramatist Thomas MacDonagh, and Pádraig Pearse's own brother Willie, all three of whom were executed with him in 1916, participating with him in a school prospectus whose goal would not be the cramming of boys with a view to success at examinations, but rather the eliciting of the individual talents and traits in each of them. Not only a barrister and a university lecturer, Pearse also became a playwright around the time when Yeats and Lady Gregory had founded the Abbey Theatre. He himself began to write plays specially for the boys of his school. 3 of them were produced at the Abbey, Yeats offering to produce one of them to help with the school's finances. The Murder Machine, his most famous educational tract, published in 1914, is basically inspired by the early Irish system of education, with Cuchulainn, the youthful warrior hero of the sagas, the ideal embodiment of its virtues. He constantly sought to inspire his pupils with his example, among the mottos attributed to him being, "Better is short life with honour than long life with dishonour," and "I care not though I were to live one day and one night, if only the fame of my deeds lives after me." With his discovery of the Irish language in his teenage years, he became a prime mover in the Gaelic League and later editor of An Clive Solish, the League's newspaper. All of this coincided with the upsurge of a popular movement dedicated to the revival of the language and the cultural heritage it enshrined. Throughout the 2 decades of life left to him, he devoted his boundless energy and talents to its work as an organizer and writer, traveling the country, setting up new branches, lecturing, all in the spirit of its founding fathers, Douglas Hyde, son of a Protestant minister, and in later years first President of Ireland, and Professor Owen MacNeill, a brilliant young Irish scholar from the north of Ireland. Those were the years when the scholarly headmaster of St. Enda's followed the non-political ideal of the Gaelic League. But gradually that would change, as more and more he would be swept up in the national movement, until, by the time of his famous oration at the grave of the Fenian leader, O'Donovan Rossa, seen here as he puts it back in his uniform pocket, it's now on show in the St. Enda Museum, by that time the scholar, the educationalist, the poet and the writer in him had been wholly taken over by the revolutionary, committed to the ideal of Irish freedom, and the die was cast for what was to come. What strange revolutionaries they were. A poet who would see his blood upon the rose, a trade unionist who said that Ireland without its people means nothing to me. Teachers, scholars, playwrights, mystics, who dared dream a dream that seemed to many a mad impossible dream and ask, what if the dream come true? In a final letter to his mother from Kilmainham jail on the day of his execution, Pearse is in no doubt that what they have done is right.
People will say hard things of us now, but later on they will praise us. This is the death I should have asked for if God had given me the choice of all deaths. To die a soldier's death for Ireland and for freedom.
What he did not know then was that his mother would be mourning not one but 2 sons, confirming the prophetic lines in a play he had written years before, that she herself would not die until long years after her young sons had. The Wellington Monument in Phoenix Park, the largest enclosed urban park in Western Europe. For generations, it has been a favoured recreation spot for Dubliners, from woodland walks to all sorts of sports and leisure activities.
The thunder and lightning is no lark when Dublin city is in the dark. So if you've any money, go up to the park. and view the zoological gardens. We went up there to see the zoo. We saw the lion and the kangaroo. There was females and she-males of every hue up in the zoological gardens.
Over 300 years ago, the deer were introduced by the Duke of Ormond, who wanted to create a great park stocked with deer, partridge and hawks. The park's restored Ashdown Castle has a visitor centre with exhibitions and an audiovisual show illustrating the park's nature and history. A falcon aloft in his gloved hand, pride of place in the entrance hall was given to the founding father, that Duke of Ormond who was so keen on the idea, for which we may now always be grateful, of making it into a habitat for all his favoured forms of wildlife. There's a tabloid illustration of some of them right there, attentively watched by a mother and child. Like others who come along, they look as if it's a most pleasant and quietly educative way to spend an afternoon.
Says she to me, it's 7 o'clock, and it's time for me to be changing me frock, for I'd love to see that owl cockatoo up in the zoological gardens. Says she to me, me lovely Jack, sure I'd love a ride on the elephant's back. If you don't get away, that I'll give you.
History was made in and about the Phoenix Park too. This fabric on a wall of the visitor centre tells the story of Lord Charlemont's volunteers on parade there in the late 1700s, when the American War of Independence had taken all available British forces out of Ireland, leaving the country open to invasion from France and Spain, then American allies in Europe. Lord Charlemont, a Protestant grandee, and his volunteers, also Protestant, declared themselves loyal and determined to defend the rights of Ireland. But their loyalty and determination was more given to commemorative monuments and convivial celebrations than to thoughts of revolt or war. The panoply of military show took pride of place, with captains and colonels in splendid uniforms abounding, and the pomp and circumstance of reviews and parades happening everywhere. Quite the fashion indeed it became, with even the women and children turning out to see their volunteers on parade. It meant some fun and games for the mass Catholic population too, who, however, were still denied any measure of civil rights. The young Theobald Wolfe Tone, seen here with his mother and brother, would in his time have seen these parades of military show in the Phoenix Park. He grew to believe that that show and that power should be used in the interests of Catholic emancipation, and even more radically, to break the connection with England.
I trace to the splendid appearance of the troops, the military review in Phoenix Park, and the pomp and parade of military show, the untamable desire which I ever since have had to become a soldier.
The exhibition areas in these refurbished outhouses were once the stables and living quarters for servants in Ashdown Castle. They housed temporary works related in some way to the life of the park now, and a more permanent exhibition on its history, from the pre-Christian burial chamber at Knockmuree, older it is said than Newgrange, down to the papal visit in 1979. Other scenes recreated in the visitor centre tell of history of a very different kind being made. Popularly known as the Phoenix Park Murders, a secret assassination group, the Invincibles, set upon a well-intentioned Chief Secretary Lord Cavendish and his Under-Secretary Burke in one of those constantly recurring incidents in the Anglo-Irish story. And the three young Ireland barristers who, under an elm in the park, founded The Nation, a newspaper to reawaken love of country, Davis, Dillon, Duffy. Finally, the Mansion House in Dublin, where the first Dáil met in 1919. The Dublin motto, "The obedience of its citizens makes a happy city," is somewhat contradicted by a modest plaque on the outer wall recalling that beginning of the end of a people's tenacious resistance to long centuries of foreign domination and oppression. The Mansion House was unfit for the visit of King George IV to Ireland in 1821. Now, 100 years later, it will be the House of Parliament for a free Ireland. Men like Daniel O'Connell were around at the time of that royal visit. Then an anonymous lawyer, a Kerry man no less, but building up to become another sort of king, king of the beggars, a leader who could rally a whole beaten people into a mighty constitutional force. His movement won an act for Catholic emancipation, but not the repeal of the Act of Union, which he had hoped to bring home with him in his hand from Westminster. Then, as formerly, acts and statutes for Ireland were rarely for the good of the plain people of Ireland, whom this well-intentioned man, Lord Lieutenant Townshend, wanted to help and got little but his name on a Dublin street and his portrait in the Mansion House. Finally, the uncrowned King of Ireland, Charles Stuart Parnell. In that long line of national leaders who walked the boards of the Mansion House, Parnell, more than any other, defined the Irish ambition. No man has a right to set a limit to the onward march of a nation. The crests of Lord Mayors of Dublin about these walls mark the years and stages of a house which has served its city for close on 300 years. Its citizens may reflect how things have changed in this island since it started its mayoral life, when the story outside the walls of Dublin's elegant mansion house was the story of those beggars, the plain people of this rich and rare land.